standards, but their actual implementation and impact. Questions have been arising around the extent of the impact and just explanations of why impact differ across particular treaties, across particular countries, and to, in a sense, support this increasingly important area of research and interest. The ideas come about to, in a sense, support researchers, practitioners, activists in this area by creating a database that will make engaging in the topic of the impact of the UN human rights treaties so much easier. In a sense, what the study is that myself, Christoph, and Rachel Marie has been engaged in, and I think many of you know about, is looking at the impact of the UN treaties in 20 particular countries. We did so and published a book 20 years ago, and now the update is happening. And in the course of that, it became clear to us that the researchers also have a lot of data, the actual first-hand primary texts, and not to get that to be lost, to create a database of those materials. And that kind of spurred the idea of a more extensive database. So we welcome you all to this introduction to this and further discussion around this idea that really is, in a sense, the brainchild of Christoph Heyns, member of the UN Human Rights Committee. And this initiative then is from the Center for Human Rights through Christoph, ourselves, the University of Pretoria, but also certainly the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, together clearly with the support and collaboration of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So welcome everyone to this discussion. I will not take much of our time. As I think you would have seen from the program, we essentially have a program in 3 parts. Initially, we'll just look at, what is this database? What does it aim to achieve in a generic and a general sense? And then we'll look at kind of a user perspective, which particular uses could this database be put to? And then the floor will be open for your discussion and questions. So please feel free to also use the chat box to insert those, but otherwise there will be an opportunity for open floor discussion. Let me then start us off by inviting Professor Christoph Heyns, to really introduce the idea of this database further to us all. Thank you very much, Christoph. And once again, also welcome to everyone who is present, I think from all the regions of the world, people from obviously the Geneva Academy and from the partners who are involved in the study and everyone else who are here, who are interested in this topic. I'm sure in the course of the event, you'll have opportunity also to be introduced to others. And if you take the floor, also briefly introduce yourselves. Christoph, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Frans. So from my part, also welcome to all participants in this discussion of a new and I think exciting project to track the impact of the United Nations Human Rights Treaty System. This is a project with the Geneva Academy, and I'm happy that Felix is joining us today, and Domenico, and then also the Global Campus, Manfred and Veronica, and it's in collaboration with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as has been the book project that Frans has referred to. And so Marmani is here, Ibrahim, Michael, Adrian, and then others are here as well, but those will be the ones that will take the floor, and very happy to have you with us. So as Frans has said, we are working on a second edition of a book that deals with 20 countries and the impact of the treaty system there, and we're finishing it this actually today. We have this webinar, a whole day webinar on that topic, but the idea is to move on now to what we for now calls the Impact Database 2020 plus, that is aimed at measuring and all the documentation to show the evidence as far as the impact of the treaty system in the various countries around the world is. So I want to just give you a bit of an introduction to that. So the idea of the starting point of the study is that the human rights system, as the world's moral compass, is, I think, as we all know, is under pressure. And there may be many reasons for that that I think we are all quite familiar with: power politics, populism, multilateralism, maybe in decline. On the other hand, there are more positive developments, such as a focus on development, which in itself is a very good thing, and the SDGs, but also it could detract the attention from the human rights mechanisms. And so the one that I want to focus on is the fact that it's not always clear what the difference is that the human rights system makes, and in particular, that the treaty system makes. So I think what is its added value? So in a world of performance management and of competition for scarce resources, I think that is a very important question to ask. What difference does it actually make? What is its impact? I think there are various ways to push back against the challenges to the human rights system and the pressure on the human rights system. New mechanisms could be created. There are those who advocate for a World Human Rights Court, or more focus on regional systems, more human rights education, impact litigation. But the part that I want to focus on, and that I think this project focuses on, is the need to track the impact of the international human rights system, and in particular, to track the impact of the treaty bodies and to establish to what extent do we have the big picture of the influence that it has. So part of the broader solution is to strengthen the UN treaty body system. The treaty system, the normative heart of the human rights system, as we know, is a comprehensive system of commitment and of monitoring that's been built up over 6 decades. The different treaties entered into force during that time. 9 treaties, 10 treaty bodies, 172 experts. So it's a massive operation worldwide. But I think, and it's clear that it makes a difference, but it's very difficult to get a sense of where does it make a difference. And I think what is clear is that it can make more of a difference if we really understand how it works and if we can get the bigger picture. So what is needed seems to be to improve the operations of the treaty bodies in Geneva. So we've had the 2020 strengthening process, and that's coming to an end. And then in the second place, and that's the part we focus on, is then to track the impact of the treaty bodies on the ground where it makes a difference. And that is then past 2020, the impact database is 2020 plus. So what would be the reasons to track the impact of the treaty system? I think the first need is to be able to understand the drivers and the inhibitors of impact. And the question that I think all of us who are involved in the system in one way or another ask us, why does it make a difference sometimes and sometimes not? And we have some sense of how often it makes a difference. On the Human Rights Committee, there was recently a study by Kate Fox, and she said 23% of the views are implemented. Now, of course, 23% is not bad in the sense that one knows a quarter of them are implemented, but one is worried about the 75%. And we don't really know what the situation is for the system as a whole if we look at the other components as well. What impact do the reports and so forth, what does it have? The second point why I think this is important is to demonstrate the relevance of the system. So some colleagues have said in Geneva when we were there that for meetings of the treaty bodies, we're saying we, to some extent, shooting in the dark. We do not really know what the implications are on the ground and get this feedback kind of loop. So from the treaty body perspective, one does not really know, but also from the ground itself, I think in many ways the system is seen as something which is very far away up there, and we do not really know what its impact is on the ground in the 193 UN states. So the question is how to move from a system which is to a large extent aspiration to one that is to a large extent impact, from one that is perhaps too soft to one that is harder. So how to harden the entire treaty system. And in order to do that, one has to track every individual line of impact, every potential line where it can potentially have an impact on the ground, combine that, and then get the big picture. Now, of course, for an individual researcher, that's almost impossible to do because one is really dealing with a massive system that over the years has had an impact and failed to have an impact in many countries and on many levels around the world. So the question is, how can one actually allow the research community, NGOs, and even those within the system itself, within the UN and within states, to understand the system as a whole and get the bigger picture. So one can perhaps visualize the impact of the system as in the center there's Geneva with the 10 treaty bodies, and then the 193 member states of the UN, who are to some extent, to one extent or another, influenced by the treaty system. But to understand that bigger picture, the idea is to isolate every single line of impact, to go back and then say for a particular treaty body in a particular year, if you look at its views at a particular session on one of those 193 countries that may have had an influence on its executive, then we identify that line of impact. We know there are many other lines as well. It could have been the general comments. It could have been the COBs of the treaty bodies. It could have been the inquiries as well. So the outputs of the treaty body may, on many levels, have, in the country itself, impact on the legislature, on the courts, the executive, and then also on society as a whole. Is it known in the country, and so forth. So every line of impact can, I think, be identified. But if you add it all up, one gets quite a picture eventually. So we don't have the time to go into that, but to say that if one then looks at the treaty bodies in Geneva, one could, for example, look at a particular view of the Human Rights Committee that had an impact in Ireland, which led to a referendum on the issue of abortion and eventually a legislative change there. Or in my own country, in South Africa, one could look, and we had a whole discussion this morning of a chapter on that, the impact that the treaty system has had over the years in South Africa in terms of its new laws during the transition to the constitution, but also much more recently on socioeconomic rights, and maybe Sandy will talk about that. But I think in that similar way, one can identify these individual lines of impact to many countries around the world. If you add it all up, there's a potential of 6 decades, 10 treaty bodies now, 193 states, many of them ratified these various treaties. So there are millions of lines of impact, and the idea is how to make this accessible. Now, of course, as we will see, technology and so forth may make it possible now. The kinds of questions that one can answer if this data is available are really a multitude of questions. Why does the impact of the treaty, of a particular treaty, differ between different countries? Is it because the country has what we called in our earlier study a conducive environment? So there may be a national human rights institution that focuses on the treaty system. There may be, these days, a national mechanism for reporting and follow-up. There may be NGOs and so forth. Are those the drivers of impact? And why does it differ between countries, and countries with those systems, do they have different outputs in terms of impact? Should a particular NGO that focuses on whether it's gender-based violence or the right to education, whatever the case may be, what should be the entry point into the system? Should they use parallel reports? Should they try communications? What works best for which line? And then, of course, other questions may be, who uses journal comments? Who's the audience? So when you write it, who are you aiming it at? How can the Geneva procedures be improved? Many questions, I think, can be addressed if one has this larger picture. So the idea with the impact database is to combine 2 components. In the first place, to gather the evidence that is available on impact that's already in Geneva in the systems of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And Adrian will talk about that in developing an algorithm per country, per treaty body, per treaty output, to get that information in an accessible way. That's the top-down kind of approach, if you want to call it that. The other one is the bottom-up, and that is to gather evidence of impact in all the countries, and for that purpose to use students, for example, students from the global campus, and Manfred and Veronica will talk about that. The other universities involved as well. So the idea is to put the top-down and the bottom-up approach together on a website, and that's the impact database. And then, of course, once that is there, is to activate the human rights in the research community, sometimes called the third UN. So the UN consists of states, and then the bureaucrats, and then the third UN, which is researchers, NGOs, and so forth as well, to actually use it. So how far are we now? You saw the book that Frans held up. We did a study of 20 countries, which we published in 2001, it should actually be. And then the next one will now be published in 2021. So 20 years later, we look at the same 20 countries, and we have country researchers in every country. Now the idea is to study all 193 countries on an ongoing basis. So where the first study looked at 6 treaty bodies in 20 countries, the second study is looking at most of those countries again, then 2 decades later. So to conclude, the Impact Database 2020 Plus project will provide evidence of how much difference the treaty system already makes and how it can be further, how the system can be further improved. So one does not want to be over dramatic, but it seems to me that the survival of the system depends on various fronts on which one needs to make the system more relevant and more responsive and more accessible, so that those who use it and those who manage it are able to meet the challenges of the time. And we hope that the Impact Database 2020 will enable the UN itself, states, and the research and civil society community of the world to take the treaty system into the future and make it as strong as it can possibly be, a hard and not a soft system, a system based on certainty and not on hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph, very much. Thanks very much for that. I think you're a very good example, Christoph, of, I don't know if it's the second and the third UNs, but combining the role and the expertise of having been on the side of academia and civil society and now as a member of the treaty body. I think those perspectives, in a sense, culminate in what you proposed to us today. We call next on Mr. Ibrahim Salama, who is, as I think we all know, the chief of the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights Treaty Branch. We thank him very much for his continuous support in our project and for being here today with us and sharing his thoughts with us. Thank you very much, Mr. Salama.
Thank you, Frans, and thank you, Christoph. In a nutshell, we find it a great idea. I have been following your work since a long time, not dedicated the amount of focus on it as I would have loved to see, but it was working very well. In a nutshell, I would say that it's literally a historical coincidence that we have the same title of the 2020 review and the Impact Database 2020. I think it's at the heart of the 2020 review. I think it is a missing link. The impact study, the impact database and study is a missing link between the treaty body system and its even rationale, its raison d'etre. I mean, this should have been from the very beginning one of the central elements that we are trying through our field offices and through our engagement with all the stakeholders to identify. But with the growth of the system, as you all know too well, tracing the impact was a fundamental, most important missing link, I would say. My second observation is to say that the Impact Database 2020 would link so many dots that we have now on the table. First of all, the dot of trying to look at the working methods of the treaty bodies, because one of the investigative questions and methodologies, I would say, when we see that the outcomes of a treaty body worked in one country and didn't work as well maybe in another, is to ask ourselves if there has been a difference in the approach. One can hardly expect an impact, for example, if the recommendations are repetitive or are too generally formulated. So we will learn a lot about the improvement of working methods by the treaty bodies, thanks to looking at the impact on the ground. It's also an important tool to link the dots between the different mechanisms and how, to some extent, what is the complementarity in practice at the recipients end for states between a visit of a special rapporteur and a recommendation of to the same effect by a treaty body. How does a general comment contribute to the same result? Of course, the impact assessment observation was not done sufficiently, not out of reduced attention to it, but out of technical and methodological complexity as well. And one of my questions to you and to all those who would speak is that how to solve the issue of competing causalities, how to really establish something that is more credible and doesn't seem like self-congratulatory, in like of what you did already on the 20 countries. So linking the dots also with the 2020 review, because I think it's only when states will start seeing upon empirical evidence that their engagement with treaty body brings benefit to them. It's not only because it's a legal obligation, it's not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's also because it brings benefit. And this side of the story has been slightly overshadowed by the strength of the advocacy, which is a good thing, but with advocacy also comes self-interest. If there is a fatigue now in engaging with the mechanisms, let's talk about it frankly. Is it coming only from the overlapping and the multiplicity of the mechanisms, or is it also coming from the fact that the impact needs to be established first? I would say that the opposite to impact study, linguistically and substantively, is simply ticking the box. And I'm sure that all the human rights experts in this system deserves much more than this. So once again, I thank you, and I'm glad for this collaboration. I thank Felix and the Geneva Academy, who have been also instrumental in, I wouldn't say subcontracting, but fully partnering with the office in addressing difficult questions in as constructive atmosphere as possible. Looking forward also as well to the Manfred and the Global Campus contribution to this, because it's quite ambitious, but it's still feasible with all the great minds I see on the screen. I'm sure that moving from the second edition to the global permanent edition of the Impact will be a fantastic adventure. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Salama. Once again, I think, Felix, your name has been invoked and the floor goes to you. So Felix Kirschmeier is with the Geneva Academy, and he's the Executive Director of the Geneva Human Rights Platform. And we certainly welcome you and also look forward to your input and perspective. Felix, thanks.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. So thank you, Franz. Thank you, Christoph. It's great to be with you here today, and actually hello to the many faces that I see on the screen. So great to see you all here virtually, as we are still in this setting where we cannot meet here at the Villa Moignier or at Pretoria or wherever, but great to see you all here. And as was just said, seeing so many great minds involved in this adventure, I'm sure that we can get to a very exciting product outcome and process. So Christoph, when you spoke before of the massive system, I had kind of a Freudian slip hearing the mess of a system. And actually, I think when we discussed the 2020 review and all the how actually the system could adapt better, it's crucial what you're doing and what I think we will be doing jointly here with that 2020 plus database. Because in a way, the treaty body impact, this is really the other side of the coin of all the work here in Geneva on the mechanisms. So as was said by Ibrahim in the Geneva Human Rights Platform, we see it ourselves as a mechanism lab, and our work is dedicated to engineer solutions to ensure the sustainable function of those Geneva-based mechanisms. But actually, while we can discuss a lot there, if we don't have the grounding in what works and what doesn't work, it's very difficult to guide such a process. So I think when we started some years ago, the academic network on the treaty body review, we looked at the efficiency of the mechanisms. We had our assumptions about effectiveness, but it's actually only when you get into the really looking at the impact that I think you can really have your reasons for a review, for reform of the system. So this treaty body impact database 2020 plus will develop a tool dedicated to filling precisely that gap of knowledge and of reasoning for the reviews of the system. In turn, that will allow the states, secretariat, and treaty body members, who I see many of here in that call also, to develop the system in a meaningful way. In light of the Treaty Body Review 2020 and the related calls for increased stakeholder connectivity, it's important to understand what happens when Treaty Body recommendations reach the domestic level. And again, this is where the database will be crucial. At the Academy, again, we have a project currently going on national human rights systems. So comparing with some pilots, how systems can actually adopt, take in, translate the recommendations coming from the UN human rights system. But again, this is just some pilot countries. and it is not this overall study, this broad study that we're just about to embark. This is why I think it's just such a great effort and really worth the effort too. Finally, let me say that the Treaty Body Impact Database also represents an incredible opportunity for our students. So like for Global Campus, with us obviously in a much smaller scale, but for our students, it would be an excellent possibility to be involved in such a project, learn more about their own country's systems of human rights monitoring and implementation, and also simply be participating in such a historic activity as it was put by Ibrahim before. I think it's a great possibility to move to a stronger system if we really take the national implementation, the national realities as a reasoning for whatever we carry on in the wake of the 2020 review, which has for now produced recommendations by co-facilitators. There should be a General Assembly resolution sometime further on, but actually what would be in there and what should be helping to strengthen the system will be determined exactly by learning better what works and what doesn't. So I'm really excited to see that project moving on. I have also been following in the past your work, Christoph, the update of the book. We held also an author's workshop here at the Villa Moignet Geneva Academy, and I'm very much looking forward working with all the partners in that project in the future. Thank you, and back to you, Franz.
We call next on Adrian Hassler, who is also with the office and will lead the data mining for this database development. So over to you, please, Adrian.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to briefly also present from a very practical perspective. I think a lot has been said now about the sort of overall objective of the project. But I just want to give you a very brief insight in what we're actually going to do at a technical level from the side of OHHR to support the project. Jumping right into it, what we are going to do is really a data mining exercise. So as Christoph just showed in his presentation, there are basically two components to the idea of tracing and showing impact. One of them being sort of looking at the international level documentation that exists to find out what the committees have actually said and how they have expressed recommendations and so on, and then what have states been reporting. And then on the other side, you have the research on the ground. So our role as OHHR, of course, is to make the documentation available. And this is something we are pursuing not only due to the study, but of course the study is also a great occasion and an opportunity to push the work of making our documentation more accessible. So what we're going to be doing concretely is that we are trying to make a lot of documents available for sort of full text search and so on. We're talking about around 10,000 documents related to the review cycles of the treaty bodies from, I think, the last 10-15 years. We will also have to see what's technically possible, because at some point the older documents just create a lot of problems at a technical perspective. So that's kind of here in this chart. It's the sort of top left corner. We have all these documents. They're usually PDF documents. If you wanna find something in there, you need to know where to look. You need to know. You need to then find within the document what you're looking for. That's the situation right now. So we are working with the Danish Institute for Human Rights as part of the impact study here. The institute has developed some very exciting tools on using machine learning to both make documents accessible and then thematically label them. So this is what we will be doing. We are trying to read in all of these PDF documents, and then which will make them searchable, and then we will use an algorithm to basically index them against a number of human rights topics, groups of affected persons, and so on. And the idea is that that will make the material much more accessible for research. It will also allow us to generate some kind of overview statistics and some, I think I mean, this is also very exploratory work, so we will see what exactly comes out of it. But we, of course, the ambition is to make it easier for researchers to look into what could potentially be interesting to look into for a specific country. That's basically the idea here. Yeah, how will it help trace impact? So what we want to facilitate is really to find all the documentation of the international level in one place, being able to run full text searches, using thematic searches, being able to trace the development of a topic over time, over a number of review cycles, and so on. So hopefully that will be facilitated. And then, of course, that should give you the researchers in the frame of the project, but also the human rights community at large, provide some cues for where to look for impact on the ground. We would also, of course, like to facilitate the research work on the ground using some of these modern technologies, but this is a bit more difficult because you would have to pull information from different sources in different languages and so on. We'll see what happens in the next years also technologically, but this is not something that we as an office, of course, can go into right now. We need to do our homework basically, and that's what we're doing here. And this is how we look into supporting the study. If you want to get an idea of what this looks like in practice, we have just relaunched our Universal Human Rights Index, which is a similar database where you can find at least the concluding observations, so the recommendations and observations from the treaty bodies and from other human rights mechanisms, and you can search them by country and by themes and so on. So you get an idea. What we're basically doing is we're going to replicate that kind of model for the reporting cycle related information that has not yet been made accessible in this way. And hopefully then in the process, we'll also develop some methodologies so that we're going to be able to do this also in the future for all the new sort of material that comes in now. So in a nutshell, this is what we're doing. You're welcome to reach out if you have any ideas or comments or questions, and yeah, please go and check out our Universal Human Rights Index. We're very proud of our relaunch. So yes, so much from my side.
Thank you so much, Adrian. We're going to go to another entity that had been mentioned already, the Global Campus of Human Rights, bringing together academic programs across the globe. I'd be proud to say that the Center for Human Rights is very fortunate to be coordinating one of those academic programs here in the African region. We have the Secretary General and the President of the Global Campus of Human Rights with us, and perhaps just to have a female face after a male-dominated panel so far, I asked the President of the Global Campus of Human Rights, Veronica Gomez, to give her reflections. You're most welcome, Veronica. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frans. Well, thanks to the organizers, the Geneva Academy, the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, in particular, Christoph Heinz, and of course the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We were very, very pleased when Christoph extended the invitation to the Global Campus to join the process of feeding a database on the impact of human rights treaties and the outcomes from treaty bodies. This is a wonderful opportunity to bring together stakeholders working in the area of human rights to do this. We trust in the ability of the Global Campus of Human Rights. It's an organization that includes a network of almost 100 universities around the world, with 7 hubs in Europe, also in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, in Asia Pacific, in the Arab world, in Africa, of course, and in Latin America and the Caribbean. We trust in our ability to make a contribution because of the objectives that we have in the area of education, postgraduate education, but also training and research and networking. So on the one hand, we every year have access to the attention, the work, the talent of around 300 students from all over the world in an experience in which we include, sorry for the repetition, experiential learning, and also strong intersectional perspectives, which we think are crucial. And we also have a very, very large body of alumni, more than 3,000 all over the world, a contribution to the impact of the 2020 Plus project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica, for that pledge and background also to the Global Campus and its potential contribution. The next person to speak with us needs no introduction, and he wears many hats, and today he wears the hat of the Secretary General of the Global Campus of Human Rights. Professor Manfred Nowak, please.
Hi, hi, Franz. It's very nice to meet so many friends at this meeting, and I, as you said, the African Master is a very important part of our global campus, and I have the privilege to be currently in Addis Ababa at the Center for Human Rights in order to teach here and also launch the global study. It shows it's an incredible network. And when I was appointed to as independent expert leading the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty, we already said we should use the possibilities that the Global Campus has. And as Veronica has said, we have almost 300 students enrolling in those 7 master programs every year. And so I asked them, would you might love it that we tell them, if your body work into your specific country, or also more specific, only one particular treaty body, I think they would be happy because they could do that as a master thesis, and again would know that their work is not only academic but has a practical impact. So from that point of view, I'm very happy that we were invited to contribute, and I'm looking forward very much to work together with you in Pretoria, with Ibrahim, Michael Wiener, with all the others, Felix, of course, to make this a project that is really successful in strengthening the impact and the visibility of the treaty bodies.
So despite this sporadic and yet very compelling evidence that is coming of the influence of the committee's work, there is still a great deal of scholarship which contests that this scholarship and doctrines on economic, social, and cultural rights are able to respond effectively to the global crises of the day. It's been argued, for example, that economic, social, and cultural rights have been powerless to reverse the tide of global neoliberalism that has done so much to fuel global inequalities in the world and led to massive poverty and social exclusion. So a more systematic and thorough tracking of how economic and social rights have impacted on the domestic systems, but also conversely how the domestic systems have influenced the treaty body doctrines and concluding observations, could be powerful tools for academics, for civil society organizations to convince skeptical governments, NHRIs, and civil society partners of the value of the system, but also to pinpoint where the gaps and shortfalls lie. And secondly, I think another value could be its educative function. it could certainly highlight and bring much more into the public domain of the judiciary, of NHRIs and CSOs, the work and impact of the treaty body system. And then finally, it can assist the system itself to be more responsive to the issues that are really affecting people and social movements on the ground, because it is ultimately on the terrain of on-the-ground impact that the future of the whole human rights system will ultimately rest. So thanks, Frans.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for those reflections. I'm sure that put the database also in the context of the broader inequalities surrounding us as we move towards concern for the impact of these treaties. I think we will at least allow, and we hope everyone would be able to stay on for a bit of discussion. I think it's too rich an introduction to the topic not to have some questions and discussions. And I have already noticed in the chat box Professor Martin Scheinen. And perhaps, if you allow, we could ask Professor Scheinen to open the floor for us. Professor Scheinen, I think, is very well known to us also, both as an academic and someone who's been deeply involved in the treaty body system himself. Please, Martin.
Thank you very much, Frans. I think it's a great initiative, and the design is highly interesting. I have some comments of methodological nature. The first one is that the database, of course, is part of a turn to, let's say, the empirical turn in international law generally, and in human rights law in particular. And I think the empirical turn is commendable in the sense that it adds scientific rigor. What effect are we really having in events in the world? And we are trying to find information about facts on the ground and how they change. So that is commendable. But my second point is that there is a problem if the empirical term means reduction to creeping empiricism, where only facts on the ground matter and the normative dimension is lost. So I think there's a need to square the circle to insist that there is a function for the treaty bodies, which is about interpreting, developing, and establishing the law. And that must not be lost in the development of the database, so that the empirical would overshadow the normative dimension. For instance, the real normative impact of the treaty bodies can be seen in many cases by the European Court of Human Rights, which have been influenced by particularly Human Rights Committee, but also Committee Against Torture findings. And that's an extremely important contribution at the general level of international law, that treaty bodies have played a function. I just mentioned the Mamat Kulov and Öcalan and Folgerö cases as three important European Court of Human Rights rulings where treaty bodies had a direct impact as to the outcomes and hence the evolution of the law also at regional level. My third point is that in particular, this is a subset of the previous comment, in particular, one should not allow states, governments to be in the driver's seat in the sense that they would be able to use the database in order to say non-compliance is subsequent state practice, which affects the interpretation or the application of the law. So failure to implement must not be taken as subsequent practice for the purpose of interpreting the law. And my final comment is that it's important also to emphasize that international law is a flexible framework in relation to domestic law, that where treaty bodies specifically pronounce on the remedy, that is not necessarily part of the normative assessment. I would insist on a differentiation about the finding of a violation, which is strictly speaking interpretation of the binding law, and then a recommendation on the remedy. They cannot always be separated, but often they can. And I think it's important to emphasize that findings of a violation must often leave room for the choice of implementation method by the respondent state. And there is room for some sort of deference, not so much in the interpretation of the treaty, whether there's a violation or not, but in choosing the remedy, in the sense that human rights law, in many cases, entails obligations of result. And as long as the result is achieved, there is leeway for the states as to choose the particular form of remedy. Thank you very much. Did I exceed my 3 minutes, Franz?